Hello, everyone. Welcome to my show, Career Startup Leadership Podcast, a podcast to spotlight world class Asian entrepreneurs, innovators, C suite executives, and allies who provide candid insights from their personal journey to inspire you. And this is your host, Priyanka Komla, and I'm here with you today on our 85th episode of Career Startup Leadership Podcast. And as a quick reminder, do subscribe to us by following me, Priyanka Komla, on LinkedIn as well as our Career Startup Leadership Podcast page to receive your LinkedIn Live notifications. And if you're watching this on YouTube, do hit the subscribe and the like so we get a chance to know that this episode has really enthralled you. Well, if you're asking me why, because we have an amazing guest, Siddha Ganju, who is also an AI expert joining us from San Jose. Hi, Siddha. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Priyanka. Thank you for having me.
Hey, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show, Siddha. And to our listeners, why you need to watch this episode? Well, we're going to talk about the wonderful journey that Siddha has had from Shimla to Hawaii to San Jose and her love for numismatics. I got the part because I just learned this word a minute ago. So we're going to learn more about her love for numismatics as well. Well, if you're curious, then you should definitely tune into this episode. Well, apart from that fun trivia, Siddha is an AI researcher who Forbes featured in the 30 under 30 list. She's also a self-driving architect at Nvidia. As an advisor to NASA FDL, she helped build an automated meteor detection pipeline for the CAMPS project at NASA, which ended up discovering a comet. Well, Siddha is also an advocate for diversity and inclusion in technology, and she speaks at several colleges and universities to motivate and grow a new generation of technologies from all backgrounds. She's also the author of O'Reilly's Practical Deep Learning for Cloud, Mobile, and Edge book. Such interesting facts about you, Siddha. Welcome again to the show. I'm super honored to learn more about you.
Thank you. And, it's really surreal to be here today because I've seen all the 84 previous episodes and there's always something new to learn from each of them. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Siddha. And Siddha has been very kind to provide one free mentoring session to a lucky live listener of ours. So all you have to do is drop in a quick hello and the country that you're tuning in from and get a chance to win this amazing mentoring session with Siddha. I'm super excited to see who that lucky winner is going to be.
Yeah, me too.
All right, Siddha, before we dive deeply into AI and how we build socially responsible AI applications, which is the topic for the episode today, there's some fun facts about you which I want to unveil. So Siddha, she grew up in Shimla and then moved to Hawaii. And then, as I mentioned, started exploring the story behind currency and studied a lot more about it. So tell us about this wonderful journey.
Yeah, so I think I was very young, maybe around 8 years of age, when, I first encountered a new currency other than the Indian currency. And the very first thing I noticed was, where did Gandhiji go? Like, what is happening? And I think that's when I learned that different countries have different currencies. And most countries try to put their best foot forward when it comes to printing a currency. And, it's kind of like getting a tattoo because it's permanent. You can't really go back from there. And the idea is that, some countries put their political leaders, some countries put their scientific principles or equipments. For example, the country of Canada, in their newer banknotes, they have a depiction of the polio vaccine. As far as India is concerned, there is the ISRO equipment on the 2 rupees note. So it's really interesting to see, what kind of values the country holds. And that's often what gets depicted on their banknotes. So I find it really interesting, from an observational and a curiosity standpoint.
So given your love for numismatics, do you have a favorite currency that you can share with our listeners?
Oh, that's a good one. I believe the currency of Australia is very bright and colorful, if I remember it correctly. And I think that is very unique and different. Because especially in the older Indian currency or even in the US currency, we see most of the colors are, brown or green. But of course, in the newer Indian currency, we've got all colors of the rainbow. And I think that's similar to the currency in Australia. So yeah, exciting money.
That's awesome. Well, given
Yeah.
that we've spoken about currency, it's always interesting to learn something new, and I'm super excited. I've learned a new terminology as well as today. So thank you for
Yeah.
that, Siddha. So
Yeah.
let's talk about your love for curiosity. That's a
Mm.
philosophy that you follow, and that's helped you a lot. As you can see, your prolific career in the field of AI, being
Yeah.
featured in the media and the limelight. So tell us a little bit more about how did it all start on being curious from a very young age?
I think my parents, my family, my grandparents, everybody always initiated that feeling of curiosity to ask questions. And, growing up, we grew up before internet or before mobile phones or screens were mainstream. So that really encouraged us to, go out and discover the world on our own. And I think that has helped increase or instill curiosity as a child. And I think I still do that. I wouldn't say very active on social media, and I'm spending most of my time outdoors, and I prefer to even work outdoors. I have this huge balcony area where I've got all these plants set up, and as you can imagine, I like walking in amidst of nature, and I think that has helped curiosity a lot. And apart from that, the reason why I value curiosity is because it's that opportunity of unveiling those unknown unknowns. And even though it's a very interesting and a difficult time because you feel like you don't know much, which is true because you're in the learning process, but that learning curve is actually worth the journey. And that's why I really value the curiosity component.
That's very impressive. And I'm sure curiosity is a very critical component in AI. So let's talk about
Absolutely.
so let's talk about how do you define social responsibility in artificial intelligence? Because it's such a humongous field, it's such a growing and exciting field to be in.
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked that. And let's generalize this a little bit, right? It's not just social responsibility in AI, but it could be any piece of technology. And it doesn't have to be commercial, it could be non commercial as well. And at the end of the day, AI just happens to be one of the ways that we can use to unearth the potential of what all is possible. Now, the short version of social responsibility in technology is that when we look at the product cycle, right, there is the really iterative development phase and then the deployment phase. Now, in the development phase, as a developer, are you asking the question that am I developing this technology in a responsible way? And for the deployment perspective, are you building technology using AI or any other technology in general? Are you utilizing that to build applications for social good? And that's kind of the two themes that I see in social responsibility. And of course, we can go into the longer version of how do you actually build this.
That's my next question. So how do you
Yeah.
build socially responsible AI applications, especially with high public value?
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Now, let's break it down into both these two themes, right? Let's start with developing applications for social good. Now, we live in a really interesting time, right? Because since the 1900s, we've seen the Industrial Revolution. We saw the rise of electricity. And as Andrew Ng says, AI is similar to electricity in terms of the impact or the potential impact it can have in the future. And similar to that, today we are surrounded with challenges that are worth solving, right? And again, we are just starting out. We have a long way to go. But think about how can we accelerate and sort of broaden the impact when we help things with high public value. For example, what can we do about climate change? Or can we build certain applications to help people with disabilities, right? That's where the high public value really comes in. And at the outset, a lot of these are interdisciplinary projects. So you get people who have expertise in AI, you get people who are domain scientists. So, for example, who know about climate change and have really studied it for so long. And when this condensed work really comes together in an interdisciplinary project, that's when you get some really exciting results and the impact can be even bigger. Now, as an example to that, in the recent NeurIPS conference for 2020, Happy New Year on that note, right, we had a workshop on climate change. And that really shows that, people on both sides of the equation are asking, who can we collaborate with on the other side? And that really shows that scientific collaboration and communication has blossomed. And it's also important to remember that all this research that's happening, it's not just good on paper, it's also practically viable, right? There is a plan for deployment. And in some cases, the plan of deployment has already been put into action. And that's kind of, pushing out the product all the way to the end.
Thanks for walking us through the logical framework of it. Go ahead.
So I also wanted to concentrate a little bit on the development portion, right? As a developer, are you asking the right questions that will ensure a good development or a responsible development of a product? Now, how do you actually do that, right? Because as humans, we're really good at being Captain Hindsight, where we see things in the rear view mirror and we realize, oops, that was a mistake, right? And it clearly looks like a mistake. So to that note, as a developer or as a project manager, we should be actively quantifying risk and making plans for failure cases. And one way to do that is to look up the AI incident database. It's known as AIID or AI incident database. And that has a list of documented AI failures. And just learning about them, reading about them gives us that information on what we can do better in the future when presented with a similar problem. And I think that's kind of from a developer or a project manager standpoint, what we can do to make things better.
You bring up a very good point, Siddha, because it's not just about creating products. It's more about asking the right ethical questions throughout that product development and implementation phase. So thanks for helping us understand, how the process works behind the scenes as well. On that note, I have a live listener who wants to say hello to you. We have Manpreet Budraja, who's joining us from India.
Oh, hi, Manpreet.
Hi, Manpreet. So Siddha, I know Manpreet is a common connection of ours, and she was my 50th episode milestone guest. So
wow,
it's always nice to spotlight young AI experts like Manpreet and you on the show. And she says it's always great hearing you, Siddha.
Yeah, and to this end, I really want to again share the spotlight as you are, Priyanka, with Manpreet, because a recent graduate, she's been doing so much amazing work, building a community of strong and responsible AI experts, and she deserves all the applause on her own.
That's awesome. Thank you, Manpreet, for sharing your thoughts as well. We have Satya K, who's joining us from India. He says, hi, Priyanka. Very interesting interview so far. Thank you, Satya. Thank you, Satya. All right, so Manpreet has an interesting question, and it's something very timely. The recent privacy policies that were launched by WhatsApp.
Yeah.
Do you think it's ethical? And how does this tie in with the importance of ethics in AI, which is what Manpreet would like to know more about?
Yeah, so I think WhatsApp at its outset isn't more of an AI product, but technology in general, I think, when we look at development of technology, it needs to have a user-centered design and a user-focused viewpoint at all phases of development. And privacy is such an important point that it deserves all the attention. Now, as a consumer of such a potential technology, I think we can ourselves ask us the question that this technology that I'm consuming, be it any social media application, right? The technology that I am consuming, am I okay with consuming that technology? And what am I giving up in return, right? And I think that's a question that we all have to ask and answer for ourselves, and then see where we stand on the risk and the failure cases, and then take that decision for ourselves.
As a user, it's always challenging for us where we start using products that are easy to use, easy to connect with your family and friends.
Yes.
And then you realize how much of information you want to give out. And that's where the bone of contention comes in from a privacy setting standpoint.
And that's exactly where education of that application is really important, right? For example, if we talk about scalable infrastructure, or if we talk about data sharing or encryption, right? A third party or someone who is not technically knowledgeable may not know what these terms mean. And that's why we need to quantify and convert these terms into something that's understandable by citizen scientists. And in part, that's also what the AI incident database, which is sponsored by the Partnership in AI, that does, because it puts out these best practices and helps educate people on what is really happening inside a certain product. And I think that's where the education portion really comes into play.
Education is a very critical component, and the reason why I'm specifying this is my mom, who's back in India, connects with me on WhatsApp while I'm here on the other side of the world. And she was the one who told me, hey, there is a new privacy policy, read it before you hit that button to say that you're accepting all of that. So people are becoming more aware, irrespective of the demographics or how tech savvy they are. And I felt like, oh my goodness, everybody's on top of things like these nowadays.
That is exactly what happened with me as well. My mom was telling me about, this new privacy policy, and I was like, I have no idea what is happening. So it takes time to educate ourselves, I think, but once we are through that educational phase, I think it's important to make that decision and see how things change with that decision.
That's awesome. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about your role as an AI advisor to NASA FDL and how the project ended up discovering a comet, which sounds very fascinating. So walk us through some of the experiences there.
Yeah, so, being an AI researcher, I do have a lot of interest in AI applications. And as we talked about, with that high public value and deployment component. And that's really what brought me to Frontier Development Lab, or FDL. And it's basically an AI accelerator that combines interdisciplinary research with the Silicon Valley startup agility, quick pivot, quick failure scenarios. And, TLDR, we basically developed a meteor detection pipeline. Now, at the outset, you may be asking, what is that, right? So let me go into the slightly deeper context. So all or most space-related applications or discoveries or any work that really goes on in that area, it's really to figure out and answer the most existential question, right? Where did we come from? Now, one way to accomplish that through the CAMS project, which stands for Cameras for All Sky Surveillance, is to figure out the trajectories of the meteors. So what I mean by trajectory is if we see a streak of light that belongs to a meteor in the night sky, can we calculate kind of its path, can calculate the equation of its path? And if we can do that, can we also figure out where in space did it come from or what its parent body is? Now, to figure that out is basically why the CAMS project started. And initially, the space scientist or the principal investigator behind it, Dr. Peter Jenniskins, he used to go out to the nearest observatory, which in Mountain View is known as Lickmill Observatory. So he used to, for an hour, drive up to the observatory, come back to the office, spend an entire day looking through the footage of the entire night sky activity and say, okay, this looks like a meteor, this does not look like a meteor. And you can imagine this is a very manual process and it's very difficult to scale that up. So using some very basic computer science and AI techniques, we were able to automate this entire pipeline, which meant that the data collection from the camera site or from the CAM site to a central office location could be automated. And that in itself led to about 5 times increase in the camera station sites all around the world. Now, on the AI component, we were able to learn from the scientists' thought process and devise an algorithm that could similarly look at a streak of light and say, this is a meteor or this is not a meteor. And through this entire pipeline, we had some really incredible results. We were able to discover the first ever instrumental evidence for a comet that was previously predicted, I think, about 100 years ago, known as the Greg Mellish comet. We discovered 2 new meteor showers, and so many new things happening. And for the future, we are actually planning on expanding the CAM station in India, and we're talking to several college sites in India. And again, the students are really excited to be learning and having a hands-on experience with the data, both from an space component and both from a AI component as well. So really excited to be a part of this.
That sounds very fascinating.
Yeah.
And currently you are a self-driving architect at Nvidia, but I understand you're also focused on healthcare specific topics as well. So tell us more about your day-to-day job.
Yeah, so I started out as a self-driving car architect in Nvidia, and as it sounds, it really entails being able to understand what the car is really seeing. For example, is that a traffic light? Is that a stop sign? Is that a yield sign? And once these objects are detected, how do we react to those signs or objects? And at the outset, it sounds like, okay, this seems pretty simple. You see something, you react to it. You see something, you react to it, right? But there's a lot more going on inside the car's brain, as you want to call it. And so that's where I would actually direct any interested listeners to NVIDIA Drive Labs, because that actually goes through, so it's a YouTube channel, NVIDIA Drive Labs, that actually goes through the intricacies of how do you actually develop a path detector, or how do you actually develop a pedestrian detector, right? Because there's so many small intricate components related to it that I could fill hours and hours of the podcast time just talking about that. But in general, we have to remember that this technology not just powers the lifestyles of today, but also of the future. And that's probably a very different perspective than most people are used to hearing. And one example of that is, how can we help the elderly community in geofenced communities with this self-driving technology? Or what is the impact of it on last mile delivery or on trucking? Or, maybe in the Mars rover, we can use something like that. So it's very interesting to see the interplay of this technology in other and more, futuristic applications. And as Priyanka mentioned, I'm also very, topically and timely interested in healthcare and seeing how and if AI can actually make a positive impact on some of the more medical and healthcare related pipelines.
I'm super excited to see what kind of breakthroughs can happen in that field through AI. And as you were talking about self-driving cars, the first thing that came to my mind as somebody who grew up in the 90s watching Cartoon Network was Jetsons, looking at how the future would be, that really opened up our perspectives on there's so much that could happen. There's a lot of evolution happening. So what are some future AI trends that you are predicting, Siddha, be it with self-driving cars or in general the use of AI in our everyday life?
To be honest, I think future is truly what we make of it. Today we are really lucky to have these amazing tools. We have a good amount of compute available. We have data available. We have information. And I think it's really up to us to figure out how to utilize it and how to really develop great applications and sustained applications for the future. And to this end, I think there will be a lot of timely or topical applications that develop. So as an example, NVIDIA announced something known as Maxine. This was announced, I believe, in the previous GTC conference, GPU Technology Conference. And all of us are doing video conferencing, right? For office, for schools, conferences, everything. Video conferences is kind of the way to go. So NVIDIA used some really cool AI-based video compression methods that really reduced the bandwidth of the internet consumption to 1/10. Now you can imagine the utility of such an amazing application, especially in the pandemic times that we live in, where everybody is using the internet. So I'm hoping to see some topical applications like that and some really interesting use cases.
I know you are an advocate for diversity and inclusion, and I feel very honored and inspired when I see you under the Forbes 30 under 30 list. And
Thank you.
you act as a role model for a lot of young women, especially women of color, Asian women, who feel like there's a lot that women can achieve in STEM, which, is an ongoing challenge that we have in terms of building the STEM talent pipeline. So what is
Yeah.
one advice you would have for young career professionals who want to be in this field of AI, especially Asians?
Yeah, I think the advice is same for everybody, that get started, find projects, have that hands-on experience, because that hands-on experience is really what puts you at par with people, who've spent maybe 10, 20 years in the industry. And, a lot of times students just graduating out of college ask, internships ask for experience, but how do you get that first experience? How do you get that first experience or that first internship? And that's where I always say, develop hands-on projects, right? So make sure you have that theory knowledge, but also implement it into a practical project. And that's really, my one go-to advice for people starting out in AI.
And we have your amazing book as well. And we have a super
Yes.
fan of yours, Manpreet herself, who says the book is pretty awesome. You are a
Thank you.
super inspiration to women. So tell us more about the book and what kind of insights can people get to know from the book?
Yeah, so, again, the book really started out as a conversation that we were having with a lot of the people that we met at conferences. And this is kind of a shared experience that my co-authors and I had, that whenever we used to go to conferences, people would ask us, how do you get started in AI? But the more you delve into that conversation, the more it seems that people have already started working or reading about AI, but how do you actually go from being a beginner to someone who is more experienced? So how do you gain that experience in AI? And that's exactly where you get to work on hands-on projects. And these projects are not small scale, MNIST type projects. These are actually relatively large scale. So as an example, if you're developing a reverse image search engine, right? And that's something that is common in Google image search engines or IKEA or Pinterest or basically any website that has images. And how do you do that, right? So would you focus on improving the representative power of the embeddings, or how would you scale up the search if you had 100 images to 1 million images to 1 billion images, right? And answering those questions and thinking about these problems is really what gives you that edge and that experience when you look at someone who has maybe 20, 30 years in the industry. And that's really what the book is about, right? Once you have an idea, what do you do about the incubation, the strategy? How do you take that and build it into a real life product that people in the real world can use? So that's kind of the entire ecosystem and the conversation that we try to have in the book.
That's pretty impressive. And we leave a link to the book on the episode notes as well. So you can get a chance to check out some wonderful work by all these different AI experts. Now, Siddha, you've had such a fascinating life and you've achieved a lot of spotlight at a very young age. But tell me this, when you have low moments in your life, how do you handle them? And what do you say to yourself?
I think low moments are a part and parcel of life. And I think that's where having friends and family and a close-knit circle really, really helps, because they're always there to support and motivate you. And at these times, I often like to think of the fact of how I started in this journey and what really motivated me to start. And, in the moment, it usually gives me enough energy to move forward and think that, okay, this is just, a low moment today, but tomorrow will be another sunrise.
That's very true. And I'm curious, how does your family see your success? Did they anticipate you to be where you are today?
Well, I don't. That's a really difficult question, but I don't think, anticipating success is something that's very easy to do. Um, and, everybody wants their children to be successful, but they've always been proud of me and they've always motivated me to move forward and, you know, dream big and have really audacious dreams and go after them. So I'm really thankful to them for helping me develop into, such a person.
That's amazing. And, as we see your success, we are super excited and we wish you all the very best as you ace more milestones and continue to be a role model
Thank
and a
you.
mentor for
Thank you.
Asian people in the field of AI.
Thank you.
So we have a fun rapid fire round for you. Are you ready for it?
Yes.
So you tell me the first thing that comes to your mind when I say the following in one word, if possible.
Mhm.
Role model.
My parents.
What does happiness mean to you?
Growth.
How do you define success?
It would be the same. Growth.
What is one fun thing about Siddha, which is exclusive to our Career Startup Leadership podcast listeners?
I think we hinted about this earlier, but I'm, really interested in gardening and learning about soil components and the right temperature and the direction of sunlight that the plants should receive. So I spent a lot of time reading about it and am really interested in it.
It was kind of funny. Before we started the show, I was talking to Siddha when she said she's from Shimla, which is in Himachal Pradesh in the northern part of India. And I said, Shimla is famous for apples. Is that really true? Is that how people who grew up in Shimla feel? And she was walking me through how winter crops are grown. So now I can connect the dots. Is that
Yeah.
how it started for you?
Yes, actually, that's true. And, the lifestyle in Shimla, I think, is very closely associated with nature, at least when I was growing up. So, everybody had that, even in school, we were taught about how do you plant trees and everything. So I think that that's something that I've taken from school growing up.
That's awesome. And
Yeah.
our last question to you is, what is your native language and one word to describe yourself in it?
My native language is Hindi, and two words would be Drid Sankalp, which mean fierce determination.
Well, that was the fiercely determined Siddha Ganju, AI expert, who talks about how, as women especially, we need to have audacious, big dreams and go after it. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways, especially in 2021, after we've seen this pandemic and handling a lot of low moments in our lives. So thank you, Siddha, for that wonderful takeaway for all of us. Do you have any parting thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up the episode?
Yeah, I do want to share that I am a huge believer in crowdsourcing knowledge and, that there's something to learn from everybody. And that's really where I think your podcast, the Career Up Startup Leadership Podcast, comes into the picture because so many people at the top of their game are talking about so many things. For example, I would have never thought how a person who's a business person would have to pivot during the pandemic. But that's something that I learned from the Rural Painter episode with Anu
Anubhav?
Bhatt, its co founder. Yes. So, these golden nuggets are really what keep me going with all these podcasts. And I would encourage the listeners to subscribe and really, try to imbibe all the knowledge that they receive from here. And it really goes to show, Priyanka, for yourself as well, how you are really sharing the spotlight with someone. And thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Siddha. I'm super honored to continue spotlighting wonderful people from the Asian diaspora so we can bring the stories, the trials and tribulations that make us who we are.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Siddha. And I hope our listeners enjoyed this episode. We're going to keep the live free mentoring session up for grabs. So all you have to do is, as you're watching this on live or on replay after the end of the episode, drop in a quick hello, the country that you're tuning in from, and a quick question or a comment for Siddha, and we'll get it answered either after the episode. And a quick reminder to continue following us, me, Priyanka Komla, and a Career Startup Leadership page on LinkedIn. So if you're watching this on LinkedIn, give us this like and a comment. And if you're watching us on YouTube, do hit subscribe and give us a like so we understand how this podcast is helping you become a better version of yourself. And to all our podcast listeners, wherever you're watching this, or hearing this, I should say, on your favorite podcast streaming platform, do continue to hit subscribe and like. We have an amazing episode lined up tomorrow with Sanath Ramesh, who's a rare disease fighting parent trying to save his kid by figuring out the latest research in the field of genetics. So we have him as our special guest for tomorrow. So do tune in tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. Eastern. Well, if you follow us on our channels, you'll get a notification as we go live. Thank you so much, Siddha. Such a pleasure having you on the show. And thank you, Manpreet. Thank you, Satya, for the interesting comments and questions as well, which kept the session very engaging and lively.
Thank you, Priyanka. And again, thank you, Satya, and thank you, Manpreet, for all your interesting questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Siddha. And to our listeners, this is your host, Priyanka Komla, signing off from your 85th episode of Career Startup Leadership Podcast, a podcast to spotlight world-class Asian leaders, C-suite entrepreneurs, innovators, and allies who provide candid wisdom from the personal journey to inspire you. Until our episode tomorrow, this is Priyanka saying goodbye.